Hi, I'm Zoe. 6 hours ago, my parents locked me out of the house while my sister Madison hosted her New Year's Eve party with 300 of her closest social media followers. They told me I could sleep in the garage or figure it out myself. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly bought something that would change everything. This morning, I woke up to 47 missed calls and a voicemail from my father saying they desperately needed my help. So what exactly had changed overnight? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The desert air in Scottsdale was surprisingly cold for December 31st. I sat in my Honda Civic in the driveway, watching through the living room windows as Madison posed for photos with her ring light setup, surrounded by perfectly styled friends who looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. The house sparkled with string lights and balloon arches, and the bass from the music thumped through the walls so hard I could feel it vibrating through my steering wheel. I had arrived home from my shift at the community center around 9 p.m., exhausted from running after-school programs for kids whose parents worked late. The side gate was locked, which was unusual, and when I tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. I knocked, then rang the doorbell. Madison appeared at the door. In a sequin dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She cracked the door just wide enough to speak through. "Zoe, seriously? Tonight? You know this is my biggest event of the year. I have brand representatives here, potential sponsors. I can't have you wandering around looking like that." She gestured vaguely at my community center polo shirt and jeans with paint stains from the art program. "I just need to grab a shower and change," I said quietly. "I'll stay in my room. Mom said you could sleep in the garage tonight. There's a sleeping bag out there somewhere. This party is too important to risk any drama." She started to close the door, then paused. "Oh, and don't park in the driveway. It ruins the aesthetic for my story posts." The door clicked shut before I could respond. I stood there for a moment, holding my keys, watching her immediately return to her performance for the camera. Through the window, I could see my mother Linda arranging a dessert table, wearing the silk blouse I'd bought her for Christmas. She glanced toward the door but looked away quickly when she saw me still standing there. I moved my car to the street and walked around to the garage. The side door was propped open, and I could see a musty sleeping bag thrown on top of a pile of old Christmas decorations. The garage smelled like motor oil and dust, and the concrete floor felt like ice even through my shoes. I stood there looking at that sleeping bag for maybe 30 seconds before I made my decision. I went back to my car, started the engine, and drove away. Not angrily, not dramatically. I just left. The funny thing about being the family disappointment is that nobody expects much from you, so they don't pay attention when you start building something real. While Madison was busy curating her online presence and my parents were busy managing her brand partnerships, I had been quietly working towards something they never bothered to ask about. For the past 2 years, I'd been running educational programs at the Phoenix Community Center. It started as a part-time job to help pay for college, but I discovered I had a gift for connecting with kids who felt invisible in traditional classrooms. The center's director, Mrs. Valdez, had noticed that enrollment in my programs consistently outpaced the others. Kids would specifically request my sessions, and parents would ask when I'd be running the next workshop. "You have something special, Zoe," she told me during my last performance review. "These kids trust you because you see them." That conversation had planted a seed. I started researching what it would take to open my own educational center, something focused on creative learning and emotional support for kids who didn't fit the standard mold. I spent months developing curriculum, researching business models, and saving every dollar I could. The night I slept in my car, I had been keeping a secret for 3 weeks. On December 10th, while my family was busy planning Madison's New Year's spectacular, I had purchased a small commercial building on the outskirts of Phoenix. It was nothing fancy, just a former dance studio with good natural light and enough space for multiple program rooms. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was the foundation for something I believed in. I'd been working with a business loan officer named Sandra Chen for months, building my credit and demonstrating income stability. The down payment had come from 2 years of careful saving, plus a small inheritance from my grandmother that my parents had dismissed as not enough to matter. They were wrong. It was exactly enough to matter. That New Year's morning, I woke up in my car parked outside a 24-hour diner, my neck stiff and my phone buzzing with notifications. The first few were from Madison's Instagram stories, showing highlight reels from her party. Then I saw the missed calls. 47 of them, starting around 6 a.m. All from my parents. The first voicemail was my mother's voice, tight with stress. "Zoe, honey, we need to talk. Something's happened with Madison's brand deal. Please call us back as soon as you get this." The second was my father, who never called me unless something was seriously wrong. Zoe, we know you're upset about last night, but we need you to come home. Madison's in real trouble, and we think you might be able to help. You're good with that computer stuff, right? I sat in the diner booth with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous year, listening to message after message. Apparently, sometime during Madison's party, someone had posted screenshots of her private conversations with sponsors. The messages showed her talking about her followers in terms that were less than flattering, calling them basic and easy to manipulate, and discussing ways to maximize profit from brand partnerships without actually using the products. The screenshots had gone viral overnight. Madison's comment sections were flooded with angry former fans, and several major brands had already pulled their sponsorship deals. My parents were panicking because Madison's income had become their primary source of revenue over the past year. My father's consulting business had been struggling, and my mother had left her job to become Madison's full-time manager. Please, Zoe, my mother's final voicemail pleaded. We know we've made mistakes, but you're so smart with technology. You could help us figure out how to fix this. Madison's career could be over. I finished my coffee and drove to the community center. Even though it was New Year's Day, I had keys and often went into work on program development when the building was quiet. I needed to think, and being in that space always helped me see things clearly. I unlocked my office and spread out the blueprints for my new building on the desk. I'd been planning to tell my family about the purchase eventually, maybe once I had the business up and running and could prove it was viable. I'd imagined their surprise, maybe even their pride. I'd pictured my mother finally understanding that I had been building something meaningful while they were focused on Madison's temporary internet fame. But sitting there looking at those blueprints, I realized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had spent so many years trying to earn a place at their table that I'd forgotten I could build my own. My phone rang. It was my father again. This time, I answered. Zoe, thank God. We need you to come home right now. Madison's locked herself in her room and won't come out. Your mother's been crying all morning. This could destroy everything we've worked for. What exactly do you need from me? I asked, my voice steady. You understand social media, right? Maybe you could help us figure out damage control. Or maybe you know someone who could help us track down who leaked those messages. Madison swears she didn't say those things, but the screenshots look real. I almost laughed. After years of dismissing my work as just playing with kids, they suddenly needed my expertise. After making me sleep in a car because I didn't fit their aesthetic, they wanted me to save their carefully constructed image. I'll think about it, I said. But first, I have something to show you. When I arrived at the house an hour later, the aftermath of the party was still scattered across the front yard. Plastic cups and confetti littered the grass, and someone had left a phone charger draped over the mailbox. I parked in the driveway this time. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she was still wearing yesterday's clothes. Oh, Zoe, I'm so glad you're here. We're so sorry about last night. We weren't thinking clearly. My father appeared behind her, looking older than I'd seen him in years. Madison's whole empire is crumbling. 7 years of building her brand. And it could all be gone by tomorrow. I followed them into the living room, stepping around deflated balloons and empty bottles. Madison was curled up on the couch in her pajamas, scrolling through her phone with tears streaming down her face. Look at this, she said without looking up. They're calling me a fraud. They're saying I never cared about my followers. I worked so hard to build this community, and now they all hate me. I sat down in the chair across from her, the same chair where I'd spent countless family meetings being told I needed to try harder, be more like Madison, contribute something meaningful to the family. Before we talk about fixing this, I said quietly, I have something to tell all of you. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken of my new building. 3 weeks ago, I bought this. It's going to be an educational center for kids who need extra support. I've been planning it for 2 years. The room went completely silent. My mother blinked at the phone screen like she couldn't process what she was seeing. My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. You bought a building? Madison said, looking up from her phone for the first time. With what money? With money I earned and saved while you all assumed I was just wasting time at the community center. I've been developing programs, building relationships with families, and creating something that actually helps people. My mother sank down onto the arm of the couch. Zoe, honey, we had no idea you were working on something this big. Why didn't you tell us? I looked around at their shocked faces, and for the first time in years, I felt completely calm. When? Exactly what I have told you? During one of Madison's photo shoots? During a family dinner where my job was described as just babysitting? Or maybe last night, while I was sleeping in my car. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down. We can fix this, my father said finally, his voice taking on the tone he used during business calls. We can use your new business as a way to rehabilitate Madison's image. Community service, giving back, family values. It could be exactly what we need. And there it was. Even faced with proof that I had been building something meaningful while they weren't paying attention, their first instinct was to figure out how it could serve Madison's brand. I stood up slowly, sliding my phone back into my pocket. Actually, you can't use this. This building, this business, this whole project belongs to me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I bought it with my money, developed it with my ideas, and I'm going to run it according to my values. Madison looked up sharply. What's that supposed to mean? It means that for the first time in my life, I'm not going to fix your problems. I'm not going to manage your crisis or clean up your mess. I'm going to focus on building something real instead of maintaining something fake. My mother started to speak, but I held up my hand. I love you all, but I'm done being the family backup plan. I'm done being invisible until you need something. I'm done sleeping in cars while you celebrate inside. I walked toward the door, then turned back. Madison, I hope you figure out how to rebuild your brand in a way that's authentic. But I won't be part of it. I left them sitting in their living room surrounded by the debris of their carefully constructed image, and I drove to my new building. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and possibility. The space was quiet and full of potential. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the areas where I'd planned reading nooks and art stations and collaborative learning spaces. This was mine. Not because I'd inherited it or married into it or had it given to me, but because I'd earned it through years of quiet work that nobody had bothered to notice. I pulled out my laptop and started working on the business plan I'd been refining for months. I had programs to develop, staff to hire, and families to serve. I had a future to build that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or attention. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the afternoon. Apologies, explanations, pleas for reconciliation. But I'd learned something important that morning. Sometimes the best response to being erased is to simply draw yourself back in with permanent ink. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged. And nobody could take that away from me. The silence in my new building became my closest companion over the following weeks. Every morning, I'd arrive before sunrise, unlocking the heavy glass door and breathing in the scent of fresh drywall and possibility. The space echoed with my footsteps as I walked through empty rooms, visualizing where the reading corner would go, where we'd set up the science lab, where kids could safely express themselves without judgment. January in Phoenix was surprisingly cool, and the building's heating system needed work. I wore layers and fingerless gloves while I painted walls in warm colors that would make children feel welcome. Soft yellows and gentle greens, nothing harsh or institutional. I wanted this place to feel like the opposite of a traditional classroom, somewhere kids who'd been labeled as problems could discover they were actually solutions waiting for the right environment. My phone had stopped buzzing with messages from my family after the first week. The silence felt strange at first, then liberating. I'd grown so accustomed to being on standby for their emergencies that having uninterrupted time to focus on my own goals felt almost foreign. But I adapted quickly, the way plants lean towards sunlight when they're finally given the chance. The community center where I still worked part-time became my testing ground for new program ideas. Mrs. Valdez had been incredibly supportive when I'd explained my plans, even offering to help me transition some of the families who might benefit from more intensive support. You've always had a gift for seeing what these kids need before they know it themselves, she said one afternoon as we watched a group of 8-year-olds work through a creative writing exercise I'd developed. I've seen teachers with decades of experience who never developed that intuition. One of those kids was a quiet boy named Marcus who'd been labeled as having behavioral issues at his traditional school. His mother, Carmen, had brought him to us after he'd been suspended for the third time in a semester. The school counselor had suggested medication and stricter discipline. I'd suggested we let him build things with his hands while we talked about emotions. Marcus had been working with me for 6 months, and the transformation was remarkable. He still struggled in conventional classroom settings, but in our programs, he flourished. He'd started mentoring younger kids, showing them how to construct elaborate buildings with blocks while discussing problem-solving strategies. His mother had tears in her eyes when she picked him up after sessions. He talks about you all the time, Carmen told me one evening. He says you're the only teacher who understands how his brain works. Are you really opening your own place? I nodded, pulling up photos of the renovation progress on my phone. It'll be specifically designed For kids like Marcus. Smaller groups, hands-on learning, emotional support integrated into everything we do. When you're ready to enroll families, we want to be first on the list, she said. Whatever it costs, we'll make it work. Marcus needs this. Conversations like that one fueled me through the long days of construction work and permit applications. I'd hired a small crew to handle the major electrical and plumbing work, but I was doing most of the painting and decorating myself. Partly to save money, but mostly because I wanted every inch of this space to reflect my vision. During one of my late-night painting sessions, I got a text from Katie Rodriguez, my closest friend from college. She was one of the few people who'd known about my business plans from the beginning. Saw Madison's latest post. Girl is really struggling with the whole authenticity thing. How are you holding up? I paused, paintbrush in hand, and opened Instagram for the first time in weeks. Madison's feed, once a carefully curated gallery of lifestyle content and sponsored posts, had become a series of increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. Her follower count had dropped from 800,000 to 200,000, and the comments on her posts ranged from supportive to savage. Her most recent post was a lengthy caption about learning and growing and taking time to reflect on my values. The photo showed her volunteering at a local food bank, but something about it felt performative. The lighting was too perfect. Her outfit too coordinated. Even her attempt at authenticity looked manufactured. I closed the app without commenting or reacting. Madison's struggles weren't my responsibility anymore, and surprisingly, that realization didn't come with guilt. It came with relief. By February, I'd hired my first employee, a recent education graduate named Alex Chen who specialized in learning differences. Alex had responded to my job posting with a cover letter that immediately told me we shared the same philosophy about kids who'd been written off by traditional systems. I was one of those kids, Alex had written. Bounced between schools, labeled as disruptive, medicated for symptoms that disappeared when I found teachers who understood that I learned differently, not wrongly. During Alex's interview, we'd talked for 3 hours about pedagogical approaches and trauma-informed education. By the end of the conversation, I knew I'd found someone who understood that our work would be about more than academics. When do you want me to start? Alex had asked. How about tomorrow? Working alongside Alex transformed the energy in the building. We painted murals together, tested activity setups, and refined curriculum plans. Alex had a gift for creating learning games that disguised skill building as pure fun. Together, we developed assessment tools that focused on growth rather than deficits. One afternoon in early March, while Alex and I were setting up what would become our sensory regulation room, I heard a familiar voice in the lobby. My mother was talking to our temporary receptionist, explaining that she was my mother and hoping to schedule a tour. I found her standing in the main gathering space, looking around with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was dressed in her usual careful style, but something about her seemed diminished. Smaller. Mom, what are you doing here? She turned toward me with a smile that looked rehearsed. Zoe, honey. I wanted to see what you've been working on. This place is beautiful. I gestured for her to follow me through the space, pointing out the different program areas we'd created. The art studio with easels adjusted for different heights and abilities. The quiet library corner with bean bags and soft lighting. The science lab designed for messy, hands-on exploration. You've really thought of everything, she said, trailing her fingers along a child-sized table. How many kids will you be able to serve? We're starting with about 40 families, but we're designed to expand. We've got space for up to 80 kids across different age groups and program levels. She nodded, then stood quietly in the middle of the main room. Zoe, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I waited, not filling the silence. We didn't see what you were building here. We didn't see how much you'd grown, how much you were capable of. We were so focused on Madison's immediate success that we missed your long-term vision. She paused, looking down at her hands. And we treated you terribly on New Year's Eve. No one should have to sleep in their car because their family is embarrassed by them. The apology felt genuine, but I'd learned to be cautious about accepting words without corresponding actions. Thank you for saying that, I said carefully. It means something to hear you acknowledge it. We're hoping you might consider family counseling with us. All of us together. Madison's been having a hard time, and we think it might help if we could work through some of these dynamics as a group. I looked around at the space Alex and I had been building, at the evidence of everything I'd accomplished without their input or support. I'm not ready for that right now, Mom. I need to focus on getting this center operational. Maybe later. Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. I understand. When you're ready, we'll be here. After she left, Alex appeared beside me. That seemed intense. You okay? Yeah, I think so. It's just strange, having them suddenly interested in my life after years of treating it like an inconvenience. People notice you when you stop needing them to, Alex observed. It's like a law of physics or something. That evening, I stayed late to work on scheduling for our spring programs. We'd received inquiries from over 60 families, many of them referrals from parents whose kids had worked with me at the community center. The demand was higher than I'd projected, which was encouraging but also daunting. As I was finalizing our staffing plan, I got a call from Sandra Chen, the loan officer who'd helped me secure financing for the building. Zoe, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. I've been getting calls from people asking about your business loan, specifically about whether it's legitimate. My stomach dropped. What kind of calls? Someone claiming to be conducting due diligence for a potential investor. But the questions felt off, like they were trying to find problems with your application or your financial backing. I didn't give them any information, obviously, but I thought you should know. After hanging up, I sat in my empty center feeling a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my chest. I'd been naive to think my family would simply accept my independence without attempting some kind of interference. I called Katie, who answered on the first ring despite it being past 10 p.m. They're trying to sabotage your business loan, she said after I'd explained the situation. That's a new level of dysfunction, even for your family. I don't know if it's them for sure, but the timing is suspicious. My mother shows up here acting supportive, and then suddenly someone's questioning my financing? What are you going to do? I looked around at the learning spaces we'd created, at the schedules for programs that would start in just 2 weeks, at the photos of families who were counting on us to provide something their kids couldn't find anywhere else. I'm going to document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every attempt at interference. And I'm going to keep building what I started. That's my girl. You've got this, Zoe. Don't let them pull you back into their chaos. The next morning, I arrived at the center to find Alex already there, setting up materials for our first trial run of the Creative Arts program. We'd invited 5 families to participate in a free pilot session, both to test our systems and to generate some positive word of mouth. Marcus and his mother Carmen were among the participants. As soon as Marcus walked into the art studio, his whole demeanor changed. His shoulders relaxed, and he started exploring the supplies with the focused intensity I'd seen so many times before. Miss Zoe, can I paint a mural on that wall? He asked, pointing to a section we'd left blank specifically for collaborative projects. Absolutely. What do you want to paint? A place where kids like me can be smart in our own way. I handed him a brush and watched as he began creating something beautiful and entirely his own. This was why I'd bought this building, why I'd spent months planning and preparing. This moment, where a kid who'd been told he was a problem was confidently creating solutions. By the end of the session, all 5 families had committed to enrolling in our regular programs. Carmen hugged me before leaving. You don't know what this means to us, she said. Marcus has been dreading going back to school, but now he has something to look forward to. That afternoon, I got another call from Sandra Chen. Good news this time, she said. I did some digging on those calls. I mentioned, and I think I know who's behind them. The person who called claimed to be from Parker Consulting Group. Ring any bells? My father's business. Of course. Thanks for letting me know, Sandra. I'll handle it from here. I hung up and sat quietly for a moment, thinking about patterns and choices. My family's first instinct, even when attempting reconciliation, was to try to maintain control through manipulation rather than accepting my autonomy through respect. I opened my laptop and created a new document titled Business Protection Protocols. It was time to start thinking like a business owner rather than a daughter, to protect what I'd built rather than hoping for family dynamics that might never change. Alex knocked on my office door frame. We've got 3 more families wanting to schedule tours for next week. Word is really spreading. I smiled, closing the document to focus on the good news. Let's schedule them. And Alex? Start keeping detailed records of all our interactions with prospective families. Contact information, conversation notes, follow-up schedules. Everything. Everything okay? Just being thorough. We've worked too hard on this to leave anything to chance. As March progressed into April, our enrollment continued to grow. We'd successfully launched 4 different program tracks, each designed to serve kids with different learning profiles and support needs. The building that had been empty and echoing just months earlier was now filled with children's voices, creative energy, and the kind of engaged learning that happens when kids feel truly seen and supported. I was working longer hours than ever, but it felt completely different from the exhausting grind of trying to earn approval I'd never receive. This was the fatigue that comes from building something meaningful, from seeing immediate impact in the lives of the families we served. One evening, as I was locking up after a particularly successful day, I found Madison sitting in her car. In our parking lot. She got out when she saw me, looking uncertain and somehow younger than her 25 years. "Zoe, can we talk?" I studied her face, looking for signs of the performative drama that usually accompanied her requests for attention. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine vulnerability. "Okay. But not inside. We can talk out here." She nodded, leaning against her car. "I've been driving around for an hour, trying to figure out what to say to you." I waited. "I'm seeing a therapist now. About the whole social media disaster, but also about our family stuff. And she's been asking me about you a lot. About how we treated you growing up, about what happened on New Year's Eve." Madison looked down at her hands. "I never really thought about how it felt from your perspective until she started asking me to imagine it." "And what did you imagine?" "That it probably felt terrible. Being dismissed all the time, having your accomplishments ignored, being told you weren't good enough to be part of our celebrations." She paused. "I'm really sorry, Zoe. For all of it. But especially for making you feel like you didn't belong. In your own family." The apology felt more substantial than our mothers had, less practiced and more painful. I could see that it was costing Madison something to say these words. "Thank you. That means a lot. I also wanted you to know that I told Dad to stop whatever he was doing with your business loan. I didn't know about it until Mom mentioned that someone had been asking questions, but when I figured out it was probably him, I confronted him about it. So my suspicions had been correct." "What did he say?" "That he was just trying to protect the family from potential embarrassment if your business failed. But I told him that was bullshit, that you were clearly successful. And that his interference was just jealousy disguised as concern." I felt a shift in how I saw Madison, a recognition that she was capable of growth and accountability that I hadn't expected. "I'm proud of what you've built here," she continued, gesturing toward the building. "I looked up your programs online. And they're incredible. You're actually helping people, not just performing help for an audience." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Are you okay? With everything that happened with your career?" Madison shrugged. "I'm figuring it out. Turns out that building a brand around being perfect is pretty unsustainable when you're actually just a regular person with regular problems. I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing all the time." "That sounds hard." "It is. But also kind of relieving. I don't have to pretend to love products I've never used or act like my life is perfect when it's actually pretty messy. Maybe messy is more interesting than perfect anyway." She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. "My therapist says the same thing." After Madison left, I walked through my building one more time before heading home. The walls were covered with artwork from our students, photos from program activities, and thank you notes from parents. This space felt alive in a way that our family's carefully curated home never had. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Tomorrow's enrollment meeting is going to be big. We've got 8 new families scheduled. You ready for this?" I typed back, "More ready than I've ever been." And for the first time in my life, that was completely true. 3 months into operating the Learning Center, I thought I had a handle on most challenges that could arise. Equipment malfunctions, scheduling conflicts, the occasional difficult parent interaction. What I hadn't anticipated was Katie Rodriguez showing up at my office on a Tuesday morning with a manila envelope and an expression that made my stomach clench. "Zoe, we need to talk privately," she said, glancing around to make sure Alex wasn't within earshot. "I found something you need to see." I closed my laptop and gestured for her to sit across from my desk. Katie worked as a paralegal at a downtown Phoenix law firm, and her serious tone suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Remember how I mentioned I was helping my firm with some research on educational nonprofits for a pro bono case?" she began, sliding the envelope across my desk. "Well, I stumbled across some documents that mention your family's name." I opened the envelope and pulled out several photocopied pages. The letterhead belonged to Parker Consulting Group, my father's business. The documents appeared to be grant applications and funding proposals, all related to educational initiatives in underserved communities. "Keep reading," Katie said quietly. "Pay attention to the program descriptions." As I scanned the documents, my confusion turned to disbelief, then to cold anger. The proposals detailed innovative educational programs for children with learning differences, creative arts integration, hands-on science exploration, and social-emotional learning support. Every single program was nearly identical to the curriculum I'd developed over the past 3 years. "This can't be right," I said, flipping through page after page of my own ideas presented under my father's business name. "These are my programs. My lesson plans, my assessment tools, even my specific Terminology. Katie nodded grimly. There's more. Look at the budget section. The funding requests totaled over $2 million across multiple grant sources. According to the documents, Parker Consulting Group had been awarded $400,000 in initial funding to develop a pilot program serving low-income families in the Phoenix area. Katie, this doesn't make sense. My father doesn't know anything about educational programming. He's never shown any interest in my work. Keep reading. There's a staffing section. I found the page that outlined key personnel for the proposed programs. My father was listed as executive director. My mother was listed as community outreach coordinator. And there, under program development specialist, was my name, Zoe Parker, M.Ed., with my actual credentials and employment history accurately described. They're using my qualifications to legitimize funding applications for programs they can't actually deliver, I said, the full scope of the situation becoming clear. And they're doing it without my knowledge or consent. It gets worse, Katie said softly. Look at the timeline. These applications were submitted 4 months ago, right around the time you were finishing your building renovations. 4 months ago, when my family was still treating me like an embarrassment. When they'd made me sleep in my car rather than acknowledge my existence at Madison's party. When they'd dismissed my community center work as meaningless babysitting. There's one more thing, Katie continued, pulling out a final document. This is a lease agreement for a building in South Phoenix. Same neighborhood where you're located, but bigger. They're planning to open their own educational center using the grant money and your stolen curriculum. I stared at the lease agreement, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The building they'd chosen was 3 times the size of mine, in a location with better visibility and parking. If they moved forward with this plan, they'd be direct competition for the families I served, but with significantly more resources. How did you get these documents? The firm I work for represents one of the nonprofit organizations that was also applying for the same grants. Our client was trying to understand why their application was rejected in favor of a consulting group with no educational background. I recognized your father's name and thought it was an odd coincidence, so I did some digging. I set the papers down and walked to my office window, looking out at the playground where Alex was setting up equipment for the afternoon outdoor learning session. 3 kids were already waiting by the fence, excited for their program to start. Marcus was among them, showing a newer student how to properly grip a softball bat. Zoe, there's something else, Katie said carefully. The grant money they've already received? It's supposed to be used for program development and staff training. If they're not actually qualified to deliver the services they promised, they could be in serious legal trouble. I turned back to face her. What kind of trouble? Fraud. Grant fraud is a federal offense. If they've misrepresented their qualifications or capabilities to obtain funding, they could face criminal charges, not just civil penalties. The irony was staggering. For months, my family had been treating my educational work as a cute hobby, something that kept me busy but wasn't real or valuable. Now they were literally betting their futures on the assumption that they could replicate what I'd built. What do you think I should do? Katie hesitated. Legally, you have several options. You could report the grant fraud to the funding agencies. You could sue for intellectual property theft. You could demand that they cease using your credentials without permission. She paused. But this is your family, Zoe. I can't advise you on the emotional complexity of that situation. After Katie left, I sat alone in my office trying to process what I'd learned. The documentation spread across my desk represented years of my creative work, research, and innovation, repackaged and monetized by people who'd never valued any of it when it belonged to me. My phone rang. It was Alex, calling from the playground. Zoe, Marcus's mom is here for pickup, and she's asking if she can speak with you about something. She seems pretty excited about something. I walked outside to find Carmen waiting with a bright smile and a folder full of papers. Zoe, I have incredible news, she said. Marcus's school district wants to contract with you to provide supplemental programming for kids with learning differences. The principal heard about your center from other parents, and they're interested in a partnership. She handed me a preliminary proposal from the district's special education department. They were looking for an outside provider to offer after-school and summer programming for students who needed more individualized support than the traditional system could provide. This could be huge for you, Carmen continued. They're talking about serving over 200 kids across 5 schools. Marcus would be so excited to have your programs available at his own school. I scanned the proposal, trying to focus on the positive opportunity while my mind kept returning to the documents Katie had shown me. The district partnership would not only expand our reach significantly, but it would also establish our center as the recognized leader in innovative educational programming for this population. Can I take a few days to review this thoroughly? I asked Carmen. Of course. They're hoping to start the partnership in the fall, so there's time to work out all the details. That evening, I called Alex and asked them to meet me at the center. I needed someone I trusted to help me think through the situation objectively. So let me understand this correctly, Alex said after I'd explained everything. Your family has stolen your curriculum, used your credentials to obtain grant funding, and is planning to open a competing center, all while maintaining the pretense that they support your work? That's about the size of it. Alex was quiet. For a long moment, walking around the art studio and looking at the student work displayed on the walls. You know what this reminds me of? Those stories about tech companies that steal startup ideas from smaller competitors, then use their superior resources to crush the original innovators. Except this is my family doing it. Which makes it worse, not better, Alex said firmly. They're not just stealing your work, they're stealing your relationships with the families you serve. If they open a bigger, more well-funded center, offering similar programs, some of your families might feel obligated to switch. I hadn't considered that angle, but Alex was right. Many of the families we served were struggling financially. If my parents offered similar programming for free, using grant money, it would be difficult for families to justify paying our tuition instead. What would you do? I asked. I'd document everything, contact the grant agencies, and make sure your intellectual property is legally protected. Then I'd focus on what makes us genuinely better rather than just worrying about the competition. And the family aspect? Alex sat down across from me, their expression serious. Zoe, I've watched you build something incredible here. You've changed kids' lives, supported families who had nowhere else to turn, and created programs that actually work. Your family didn't believe in any of that when it was yours, but now they want to profit from it? Alex shook their head. That's not love. That's exploitation. The next morning, I called Sandra Chen, my loan officer, and scheduled a meeting to discuss protecting my business interests. I also reached out to an intellectual property attorney that Katie had recommended. But before I took any legal action, I decided I needed to confront my parents directly. They deserved a chance to explain themselves, and I needed to hear their justification for what they'd done. I called my mother and asked if we could meet for coffee. She suggested the upscale cafe in Scottsdale where she usually met her friends, but I insisted on neutral territory. We agreed on a small coffee shop near the university, somewhere I'd gone as a student when I needed to study in peace. My mother arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing about traffic that didn't exist at 2 in the afternoon. She ordered an elaborate drink with multiple modifications while I stuck with black coffee. You sounded serious on the phone, she said, settling into the chair across from me. Is everything okay with the center? Actually, I wanted to ask you about Parker Consulting Group's new educational initiative. The change in her expression was immediate and telling. Her practiced smile faltered, and she busied herself stirring her drink. I'm not sure what you mean, honey. I pulled out copies of the grant applications and slid them across the small table. I mean these funding proposals that use my curriculum and my credentials to obtain money for programs you can't actually deliver. She stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression that seemed more resigned than surprised. How did you find out about this? That's not really the important question, Mom. The important question is why you thought it was acceptable to steal my work and use my name without my permission. She sighed, suddenly looking older than her 58 years. Zoe, your father's business has been struggling for 2 years. We've been living off Madison's influencer income, but after her brand collapsed, we were facing bankruptcy. When we saw how successful your programs were, we thought maybe there was a way to scale them up, to create something bigger that could support the whole family, without involving me in the decision or offering me any of the profits. We were planning to bring you in once we got the funding approved. We thought you'd be excited about the opportunity to reach more kids. I felt the familiar frustration of being managed rather than respected, of having decisions made about my life without my input. Mom, these grants total over $2 million. You were planning to build an entire business on my work and then graciously invite me to participate? We're family, Zoe. We thought you'd understand that what's good for the family is good for everyone. Except when I was sleeping in my car on New Year's Eve, I wasn't family enough to come inside. When I was building these programs, I wasn't family enough to be taken seriously. But now that my work can make you money, suddenly I'm family again? My mother's composure cracked slightly. We made mistakes with how we treated you. But that doesn't mean we can't work together now to create something bigger and better. Better for who? You've already leased a building and started spending grant money. What exactly would my role be in this family business? She hesitated, confirming what I'd already suspected. They plan to use my expertise to make their venture legitimate while maintaining control of the organization and the finances. We'd want you to be the program director, of course. You'd have complete control over the educational content, while you and Dad control the business and keep the profits? Zoe, that's not fair. Your father has years of business experience in consulting for corporate clients, not in running educational programs for children. Mom, do you even understand what these grants are for? The populations they're meant to serve? The outcomes you're supposed to achieve? Her silence answered my question. I gathered the documents and stood up. I'm going to give you and Dad one chance to voluntarily withdraw these applications and return any money you've already received. If you don't, I'll report the fraud myself. Zoe, please, don't destroy your family over this. I looked down at her, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time that she viewed my autonomy as destruction and my success as threat. I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm protecting what I built. There's a difference. That afternoon, I met with the intellectual property attorney Katie had recommended. Rebecca Martinez was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in cases involving family businesses and stolen innovations. This is a surprisingly clear-cut case, she said after reviewing the documents. They've used your credentials, your curriculum, and your methodologies to obtain funding under false pretenses. We can pursue this both as intellectual property theft and as grant fraud. What would that process look like? We'd start by filing complaints with each of the funding agencies, providing evidence that the applications contained false information. We'd also file for injunctive relief to prevent them from using your materials or credentials in the future. She paused. The criminal aspects would be handled by federal prosecutors, but our civil case would be strong regardless of whether criminal charges are filed. And the timeline? If we move quickly, we could have the injunctive relief in place within 2 weeks. The funding agencies would likely freeze any remaining grant money pending investigation. I thought about Marcus and Carmen, about the district partnership proposal, about Alex and all the families who'd found something at our center that they couldn't find anywhere else. Let's do it. Rebecca nodded. I'll need you to document everything about the development of your curriculum. Notes, drafts, correspondence, anything that establishes the timeline of your work and your ownership of the intellectual property. That evening, I stayed late at the center, pulling together years of documentation. Emails with Mrs. Valdez about program development. Draft lesson plans with timestamps. Photos of early implementations at the community center. Training materials I'd created for volunteers. As I organized the evidence of my work, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't about punishing my family or seeking revenge. It was about establishing that my innovations belonged to me, that my expertise had value, and that success I'd earned couldn't be appropriated by people who'd never supported it. Alex knocked on my office door around 8 p.m., carrying coffee and a concerned expression. How are you holding up? Better than I expected, actually. I keep thinking I should feel guilty about taking legal action against my parents, but mostly, I just feel determined. Good. You should feel determined. What they're doing is wrong on multiple levels. I showed Alex the documentation I'd compiled, the clear timeline of innovation and development that proved my ownership of the programs they'd tried to steal. This is incredible work, Zoe. Looking at it all together like this, it's obvious how much thought and research went into developing these approaches. Alex paused, studying a curriculum outline I'd drafted 2 years earlier. Your family had access to all this evidence of your expertise, and they still treated your work like it didn't matter until they could profit from it. The weird part is that I think they genuinely believed they were helping me by scaling up my programs. Like they couldn't imagine that I might want to control my own innovations. That's not help, that's colonization. They saw something valuable that you created, and they assumed they could improve it by putting themselves in charge. The next morning, Rebecca filed our complaints with the grant agencies and requested emergency injunctive relief. By afternoon, we had our first response. The Arizona Education Foundation had immediately frozen the remaining funds from their grant pending a full investigation. My phone started ringing within hours. First my mother, then my father, then Madison. I didn't answer any of the calls, but I listened to the voicemails. My father's message was the most revealing. Zoe, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but you're going to destroy legitimate opportunities for kids who need help. These programs could serve hundreds of families if you'd stop being selfish and think about the bigger picture. Even faced with evidence of their fraud, he was positioning my response as selfishness rather than self-protection. Madison's voicemail was different. Zoe, I just found out what Mom and Dad were doing with your work. I had no idea, and I'm horrified. Please call me back. We need to talk. But it was my mother's message that surprised me most. Zoe, your father is furious, but I think I'm starting to understand why you're doing this. Can we please talk? Just the two of us? That evening, Katie stopped by the center with Chinese takeout and moral support. How does it feel to be officially fighting back? She asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Terrifying. And liberating at the same time. I keep waiting for the guilt to hit, but it hasn't happened yet. Maybe because you know you're doing the right thing. I showed Katie the latest correspondence from Rebecca's office. 3 more funding agencies had frozen payments pending investigation, and the federal prosecutor's office had opened a preliminary inquiry into the grant applications. Your parents are probably starting to realize how serious this is, Katie observed. I hope so. I gave them a chance to fix this voluntarily, and they chose to dismiss my concerns instead. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. District partnership meeting moved up to tomorrow. They want to fast-track the proposal. Something about competing offers from other providers. I stared at the message, understanding immediately what had happened. My parents had approached the same school district with their own proposal, using my stolen curriculum and their grant funding to undercut our pricing. Katie, they're not just stealing my work. They're actively trying to destroy my business. She looked up from her lo mein. What do you mean? I explained about the district partnership and Alex's text. If they can offer similar programming for free using grant money, they can eliminate my center as competition while positioning themselves as the established provider in this market. That's not just theft, that's predatory business practices. And it's exactly what Alex warned me about. The tech company model of stealing innovations and then using superior resources to crush the original creator. I called Rebecca's office and left a message about this new development. Then I spent the rest of the evening preparing for the district meeting, determined to present our center as the innovative, authentic provider we actually were. But as I worked on our presentation, I couldn't shake the realization that my family's betrayal was deeper and more strategic than I'd initially understood. They hadn't just stolen my work impulsively, they'd developed a comprehensive plan to appropriate my innovations, my relationships, and my market position. The battle wasn't just about intellectual property anymore. It was about whether they could succeed in erasing me from my own success story. The school district meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., but I arrived at their administrative building 30 minutes early to review my presentation one final time. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a familiar silver sedan in the front row. My father's car. I sat in my Honda for a moment, watching Tom Parker stride confidently toward the building entrance with a leather portfolio under his arm and the bearing of someone who'd never doubted his right to be anywhere. He was dressed in his best consulting uniform, navy suit, polished shoes, the kind of authoritative presence that had impressed corporate clients for decades. Alex pulled into the space next to me, rolling down their window. Is that your dad? Unfortunately. Well, this should be interesting. You ready to show them what authentic expertise looks like? I gathered my materials and walked into the building with Alex beside me. The district's conference room was on the 3rd floor, and as we approached, I could hear my father's voice through the partially open door. He was in full presentation mode, speaking with the confident cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The Parker Educational Initiative represents a breakthrough approach to serving students with diverse learning needs, he was saying. Our comprehensive model integrates therapeutic support with innovative pedagogy, creating measurable outcomes for participating families. Dr. Sarah Williams, the district's special education director, glanced up as Alex and I entered. Ms. Parker, perfect timing. We were just hearing about some very impressive programming options. My father turned toward us, and I watched his expression shift from confidence to something more complex when he saw me. Surprise, maybe even guilt. But also a hardening around his eyes that suggested he'd already decided how this confrontation would play out. Zoe, he said evenly. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I imagine not, considering you're presenting my curriculum as your own innovation. Dr. Williams looked between us with growing confusion. I'm sorry, could someone explain what's happening here? Mr. Parker, you didn't mention that Ms. Parker was involved in your educational initiative. There seems to be some confusion about intellectual property, my father said smoothly. Family businesses can be complicated when it comes to determining individual versus collaborative contributions. I set my portfolio on the conference table and opened it to reveal the timeline documentation I'd prepared. Dr. Williams, everything my father just described to you was developed by me over the past 3 years while working at the Phoenix Community Center. I can provide timestamped documentation proving the creation and evolution of every program component. That's quite an accusation, my father responded, his voice taking on the dismissive tone I'd heard countless times growing up. Zoe has certainly contributed to some aspects of the programming, but the comprehensive business model and scaling strategies represent significant additional development. Alex stepped forward. Mr. Parker, we have copies of the grant applications your company submitted. They use Ms. Parker's exact curriculum descriptions, her assessment tools, and her credentialed background to establish legitimacy. Unless you're claiming you developed identical programming independently? The room fell silent. Dr. Williams was studying both of us carefully, clearly trying to assess which version of events was accurate. Perhaps, she said finally, you could both present your approaches separately, and we can evaluate them on their own merits. My father nodded confidently. I'd be happy to detail the Parker Educational Initiative's comprehensive service model. Actually, I said, I'd prefer to demonstrate rather than just describe. I turned to Dr. Williams. Do you have any students available who might benefit from a brief assessment and program recommendation? I'd like to show you how our center actually works with individual learners. Dr. Williams considered this. We do have a student whose parents have been seeking additional support. 10-year-old with processing differences who's been struggling in traditional classroom settings. Would you be comfortable doing a brief consultation? 20 minutes later, we were in a smaller conference room with Jamie, a bright-eyed fourth grader, who'd been fidgeting in his chair since introductions began. His mother, Mrs. Chen, sat nearby looking tired and hopeful in equal measure. Jamie, I said, settling into the chair across from him, I hear school has been feeling pretty tough lately. Can you tell me what parts are the hardest? Writing, he said immediately. And sitting still during math. And reading out loud. He paused. Basically everything except recess and art class. I pulled out a small kit I always carried with various tactile materials and creative tools. What if we tried doing some math while standing up? And what if writing didn't have to involve pencils? For the next 15 minutes, I guided Jamie through a series of activities that assessed his learning style while feeling like games. He solved math problems using colored blocks while walking around the room. He told stories using small figurines while I transcribed his words. He demonstrated reading comprehension by drawing pictures that showed his understanding of concepts. By the end of the session, Jamie was smiling and engaged in a way that Mrs. Chen clearly hadn't seen in a school setting. He's kinesthetic and highly creative, I explained to the group. Traditional classroom environments don't match his neurological wiring, but that doesn't mean he's behind academically. He just needs instruction that honors how his brain processes information. Mrs. Chen was wiping away tears. No one has ever explained it like that before. Everyone just keeps saying he needs to try harder to focus. I handed her a written summary of Jamie's strengths and specific recommendations for supporting his learning style. Focus isn't Jamie's problem. The delivery method is the problem. Dr. Williams had been taking notes throughout the demonstration. That was remarkable. Mr. Parker, would you like to show us your approach with Jamie? My father had been unusually quiet during the entire consultation. Our model focuses more on systematic interventions and data collection, he said. Individual assessments would be conducted by our trained specialists. And who would those specialists be? Alex asked. The question hung in the air. My father's grant applications had promised specific expertise that his company didn't actually possess. We're in the process of recruiting qualified staff, he said finally. Dr. Williams closed her notebook. I think I have enough information to make a recommendation to our leadership team. Thank you both for your time. As we left the building, my father caught up with me in the parking lot. Zoe, this competition between us isn't good for anyone. These kids need services, and we should be working together rather than fighting over territory. I turned to face him fully. Dad, there's no competition here. You stole my work and tried to profit from it without my knowledge or consent. That's not business competition, that's fraud. You're being dramatic. Family businesses share resources all the time. We don't have a family business. I have a business that I built while you were telling everyone my work didn't matter. Now that you need money, suddenly my expertise is valuable enough to steal? His expression hardened into the familiar pattern of dismissal I'd seen countless times. Nobody stole anything. You developed some nice activities while working with kids, but turning that into a scalable business model requires skills you don't have. Skills like obtaining funding under false pretenses? Skills like promising services you can't deliver? Skills like understanding markets, managing finances, building strategic partnerships. The things that turn good intentions into sustainable impact. I felt something shift inside me, a clarity that cut through years of self-doubt and family conditioning. Dad, you're right that building a sustainable business requires specific skills. That's why I spent 2 years developing my business plan, securing proper financing, hiring qualified staff, and building authentic relationships with the families we serve. I gestured toward the district building. What just happened in there? Is the difference between someone who understands the work and someone who's trying to fake their way through it. Zoe, you're making a mistake that could hurt your whole family. No, Dad. You made a mistake when you decided my success was something you could appropriate instead of something you should respect. That afternoon, Rebecca called with news. That both vindicated my decision and escalated the situation significantly. The federal investigation has expanded, she said. Turns out your parents applied for grants from 7 different agencies using variations of your curriculum. Total funding requests exceed $3 million. I sat down heavily in my office chair. $3 million? And there's more. The investigators found evidence that they've been marketing their services to other school districts across Arizona. They've got presentations scheduled in Tucson and Flagstaff next week. The scope of their operation was far beyond what I'd imagined. This wasn't just local fraud, they'd been building a statewide business based entirely on my innovations. Rebecca, can we stop the other presentations? The injunctive relief should cover that, but enforcement might take a few days. However, I have some better news. The district you met with today has already called to express interest in moving forward with your center exclusively. They made a decision that quickly? Dr. Williams was apparently very impressed with your demonstration. She told me that the contrast between authentic expertise and borrowed credentials was obvious. That evening, Alex and I were cleaning up after our last program session when my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Local news stations, it turned out, had picked up the story about grant fraud in educational services. The first reporter I spoke with was Maria Santos from Channel 12 News. Miss Parker, can you comment on the allegations that your parents used your credentials and curriculum to obtain federal grants fraudulently? I'd been dreading this moment, when private family dysfunction would become public controversy. But sitting in my center, surrounded by evidence of the authentic work we were doing, I felt surprisingly calm. I can confirm that my intellectual property was used without my permission to secure funding for services that couldn't be delivered as promised, I said carefully. My primary concern is ensuring that families who need educational support get access to qualified providers. What impact has this situation had on your own educational center? We continue to serve families with the same commitment to excellence we've always maintained. Our focus is on the kids we support, not on this legal situation. Some people might wonder why you're taking legal action against your own family. I paused, thinking about Marcus and Jamie and all the other kids whose learning differences had been treated as problems to fix rather than strengths to develop. Protecting children from ineffective services isn't about family politics, I said finally. It's about professional responsibility. The story aired that evening, and by morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Most of the calls were supportive, but several were from families asking if our center was the real program they'd heard about. Carmen called during lunch. Zoe, I just saw the news. I can't believe your parents did that to you. How's Marcus handling all the attention? He's actually proud that his teacher is standing up for what's right. He told his whole class that you taught him it's important to protect good things from people who try to take them. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Madison appeared at our reception desk looking uncharacteristically subdued and asking if we could talk privately. I had no idea how extensive this was, she said once we were alone in my office. I knew Dad was struggling financially, but I didn't know he was committing crimes to fix it. How are Mom and Dad handling the media attention? Badly. Dad's furious that you've made this public, as if the fraud investigation wasn't going to come out anyway. Mom's been crying for 2 days. Madison paused. But I think she's starting to understand what they actually did to you. And you? How are you handling all this? Honestly? I'm relieved that someone in our family finally stood up to Dad's manipulation. I've been in therapy for months trying to figure out why I always felt like I had to perform for his approval. And watching you refuse to back down is kind of inspiring. Madison pulled out her phone and showed me a draft Instagram post. It was a photo of her in casual clothes with no makeup, smiling genuinely at the camera. I'm thinking about posting this with a caption about supporting people who do real work instead of just performing success. Would that be okay with you? The post was simple and authentic in a way Madison's content had never been. You don't need my permission to be genuine, Madison. I know. But I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built here, and I'm sorry it took a federal investigation for me to say that publicly. The next week brought a series of developments that shifted the entire situation. 3 more school districts had reached out about partnerships with our center. The Arizona Education Foundation had not only frozen my parents' grants but also announced new oversight procedures for future funding applications. And most surprisingly, 2 families who'd been considering my parents' program had enrolled their children with us instead. Word travels fast in the special needs community, Alex observed as we reviewed the enrollment applications. Parents research providers carefully, and authentic recommendations matter more than marketing. Rebecca called on Friday with what she described as an interesting development. Your parents' attorney has reached out about a settlement discussion. They're prepared to acknowledge wrongdoing and discuss restitution in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. What kind of restitution? Full return of grant money already received, public acknowledgement of your intellectual property rights, and cessation of all competing business activities using your materials. I thought about the families who'd been promised services that my parents couldn't deliver, about the legitimate providers who'd lost funding opportunities to fraudulent applications, about the kids whose needs would go unmet because resources had been diverted to a fake program. Rebecca, I appreciate the settlement offer, but I'm not interested in helping them avoid consequences for what they did. You want to proceed with the criminal referral? I want to make sure this doesn't happen to other families or other small business owners. If that requires criminal prosecution, then that's what it requires. That weekend, I spent Saturday morning at the center with Jamie and Mrs. Chen, working on developing a home support plan that would complement his school programming. Jamie had made remarkable progress in just 2 weeks, not because we'd fixed his learning differences, but because we'd created an environment where those differences became advantages. You know what's funny? Mrs. Chen said as we watched Jamie build an elaborate story problem using blocks and action figures. 6 months ago, I was convinced something was wrong with him. Now I realize something was wrong with how everyone else was trying to teach him. That's the thing about authentic education, I replied. It adapts to the learner instead of expecting the learner to adapt to arbitrary systems. Sunday evening, I got a call from my mother. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd heard it in years. Zoe, I need you to know that I understand now what we did to you. Not just with the grants, but for years before that. We treated your work like it didn't matter because it threatened our assumptions about success and value. I waited for her to continue. I'm not asking you to drop the legal case. I think maybe we need to face real consequences for what we did. But I am asking if there's any possibility that we might rebuild some kind of relationship after this is over. Mom, that would depend on whether you actually change how you treat people whose success doesn't match your expectations. I'd like to try. Would you be willing to consider family counseling once the legal situation is resolved? Maybe. But only if Dad is genuinely committed to understanding what he did wrong, not just managing the consequences. I think this situation might have gotten his attention in a way that nothing else could. After hanging up, I walked through my center one more time before heading home. The walls were covered with student artwork, family photos, and thank you notes that represented genuine impact rather than performed success. The space hummed with the energy of authentic learning, the kind that happens when educators focus on understanding rather than controlling. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. Tomorrow's Washington Post interview confirmed for 10 a.m. You ready to tell this story to a national audience? I typed back, ready to make sure other small business owners know they don't have to accept family exploitation as the price of keeping peace. Because that's what this battle had really been about. Not just protecting my intellectual property or my business, but establishing that authentic work deserved authentic respect, regardless of who was threatened by someone else's success. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time in my life, I was fighting from a position of strength rather than defending from a position of weakness. And that made all the difference. The Washington Post interview took place in my center's main learning space, surrounded by the colorful evidence of children's creativity and growth. Reporter David Kim had flown in from D.C. specifically to cover what he called a case study in family exploitation and small business resilience. As his photographer captured images of student artwork and innovative learning stations, I felt proud of what we'd built here. Ms. Parker, your story has resonated with thousands of small business owners who've faced similar challenges with family members appropriating their work, David said, settling into one of our child-sized chairs with his notebook. What would you say to someone who's currently facing this type of exploitation? I thought about all the messages I'd received since the story broke nationally. Entrepreneurs whose relatives had stolen business plans, artists whose family members had copied their work, innovators who'd watched their ideas get commercialized by people who'd never supported them. Document everything, I said. Keep records of your creative process, your development timeline, your original ideas. Don't assume that family loyalty will protect your intellectual property, because people who truly respect you won't put you in that position in the first place. The federal prosecutors announced yesterday that they're moving forward with criminal charges against your parents. How does that feel? I looked around at the learning environment we'd created, thinking about all the families whose lives had been positively affected by authentic educational programming. It feels like accountability. When people commit fraud that affects vulnerable populations, there should be consequences regardless of their relationship to the victim. Have you had any contact with your parents since the charges were filed? My mother has reached out through our attorney to express genuine remorse and interest in making things right. My father hasn't acknowledged any wrongdoing yet. I paused. But I'm not holding my breath for that acknowledgement. The photographer asked me to demonstrate one of our programs, so I called over Lily, a 7-year-old who'd been struggling with traditional reading instruction. Within minutes, she was confidently identifying sight words using a movement-based game that honored her need for physical activity while learning. This is what authentic education looks like, I explained to David as Lily beamed with pride at her progress. We adapt our methods to match how children naturally learn, instead of expecting them to adapt to systems that don't work for their neurological wiring. After the interview wrapped up, I spent the rest of the morning in administrative meetings. Our enrollment had grown to capacity, with a waiting list of over 60 families. The district partnership had been formalized, adding programming for 180 additional students across 5 schools. We'd hired 3 new staff members and were already planning expansion into a second location. Alex knocked on my office door around lunchtime. "Zoe, there's someone here to see you. Says she's from the Department of Education in D.C. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez introduced herself as a policy specialist who'd been following our case as part of a broader investigation into grant fraud in educational services. She was a slight woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an intensity that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Ms. Parker, your situation has highlighted some serious gaps in our oversight procedures," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "We're developing new protocols to prevent this type of fraud, and we'd like your input on what those safeguards should look like." "What kind of input?" "We're convening a task force of legitimate providers to help design better verification processes for grant applications. People who actually deliver the services they promise, who have real credentials and authentic track records." She paused. "Your case has shown us how easy it is for someone to fake expertise in this field." I spent the next hour describing the red flags that should have been obvious in my parents' applications. No demonstrated experience with the target population. No qualified staff already in place. No partnerships with existing service providers. No documentation of program outcomes from pilot implementations. The most telling factor, I explained, was that they promised to serve populations. They'd never worked with using methodologies they couldn't explain in detail. Dr. Rodriguez took extensive notes. "Would you be willing to serve on our task force? The time commitment would be about 1 meeting per month, plus review of proposed policy changes." "Absolutely. I want to make sure other small providers don't face what I've been through." That afternoon brought news that shifted the entire landscape of our situation. Rebecca called with an update that was both vindication and closure. "The federal judge denied your parents' motion to dismiss the charges," she said. "But more importantly, they've agreed to a plea bargain that includes full restitution and a permanent injunction against using your intellectual property." "What does the restitution look like?" "Complete repayment of all grant money received. Plus penalty. And they've agreed to public acknowledgement that the programs were your creation, not theirs." "And the injunction?" "They can never again use your name, your credentials, your curriculum, or any derivatives of your work for any business purpose. It's permanent and enforceable in any jurisdiction." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "What about the criminal charges?" "Your father will plead guilty to 1 felony count of grant fraud and serve 18 months of probation with community service requirements. Your mother's charges are being reduced to a misdemeanor with probation only, given her cooperation with the investigation." After hanging up with Rebecca, I sat quietly in my office processing the fact that this phase of the battle was essentially over. My intellectual property was protected. The fraud had been exposed and punished. The families who'd been promised fake services had been directed to legitimate providers. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my own value and my right to protect what I'd built. Alex appeared in my doorway with afternoon coffee and an expression of cautious celebration. "So we won? We survived. And we protected the work. That feels like winning to me. What happens now?" I pulled out the expansion plans we'd been developing. "Now we focus on what we've always been focused on. Building something real that makes a difference for families who need it." That evening, I stayed late to prepare for the next day's programming, but also to enjoy the quiet peace of my center after hours. The building felt different now that the legal uncertainty was resolved. More solid, more permanent, more truly mine. My phone rang around 7 p.m. It was Madison. Zoe, I saw the post article online. You looked really confident and professional. I'm proud of you. Thank you. How are you doing with everything? Better than I expected. My therapist says that watching you stand up to Dad has helped me understand that I don't have to perform for his approval either. She paused. I've been thinking about what kind of work actually matters to me, instead of what generates the most engagement. What have you discovered? That I might actually be good at helping other people who've lost themselves in social media performance. Like, turning my experience into something that helps instead of just something that gets views. That sounds authentic. It feels scary and exciting at the same time. Kind of like how you must have felt when you decided to open your center. Exactly like that. We talked for another 20 minutes about Madison's emerging plans to develop workshops for young people struggling with social media identity issues. It was the longest genuine conversation we'd had in years, free from the competitive dynamics that had defined our relationship since childhood. A few days later, Mrs. Chen stopped by during pickup time with news that perfectly illustrated why our work mattered. Zoe, I had Jamie's IEP meeting at school today, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. For the first time ever, they're talking about his strengths instead of just his deficits. They want to implement some of the strategies you've been using here. Jamie ran up to us, backpack bouncing, full of energy and confidence. Miss Zoe, guess what? I'm going to help teach other kids how to do math while moving around. My teacher says I'm an expert now. That's amazing, Jamie. What does it feel like to be recognized as an expert? It feels like people finally see the real me instead of just the parts that don't work in regular classrooms. After they left, I stood in our lobby looking at the photo gallery we'd created of student successes. Jamie's transformation was documented there, but so were dozens of others. Marcus, who'd gone from being labeled as behavioral problem to mentoring younger children. Sarah, whose anxiety had decreased dramatically once she found learning approaches that matched her processing style. David, whose creative genius had finally been channeled into academic achievement through arts integration. Each photo represented a child who'd been misunderstood by traditional systems but had flourished when given appropriate support. Each success story was proof that the work we were doing was worth protecting. My phone buzzed with a text from Katie, drinks to celebrate federal victory? I'll bring champagne and you can tell me about the expansion plans. 2 hours later, we were sitting on my apartment balcony overlooking the Phoenix skyline, processing everything that had happened over the past 6 months. You know what's amazing? Katie said, refilling our glasses. 6 months ago, you were sleeping in your car because your family was embarrassed by your existence. Now you're a federal case study in protecting intellectual property and you're advising the Department of Education on policy reform. It doesn't feel dramatic when you're living through it day by day. It just feels like making the next right decision. That's probably why you succeeded. You stayed focused on the work instead of getting caught up in the family drama. I had to. The kids we served deserved consistent programming regardless of what my parents were doing behind the scenes. Katie raised her glass. To building something real in a world full of performance. To protecting what matters from people who don't understand its value. The following week brought an unexpected phone call that put the entire experience into perspective. Dr. Williams from the school district called with news about the statewide impact of our case. Zoe, I wanted you to know that 3 other districts have discovered similar situations with providers who'd misrepresented their qualifications. Your willingness to expose the fraud in your own case has protected hundreds of other families from ineffective services. I'm glad something positive came out of such a difficult situation. There's more. The state education department is implementing new verification requirements for all contracted services. They're calling it the Parker Protocol, after your case. I almost laughed at the irony. My name would be associated with protecting authentic educational services, while my parents' names would be associated with trying to fake them. That afternoon, I received a handwritten letter forwarded through Rebecca's office. The return address showed it was from my mother, though it had been written from the minimum security facility where she was serving her community service requirement. Dear Zoe, it began. I'm writing this from the literacy center where I'm completing my court-ordered volunteer hours. I'm helping adults learn to read, many of whom were failed by educational systems that didn't understand their learning styles. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now seeing firsthand the importance of the work you've dedicated your life to. The letter continued for 3 pages, describing her growing understanding of authentic education and her recognition of how she'd devalued my expertise for years. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, she simply acknowledged the harm she'd caused and expressed genuine pride in what I'd accomplished. I understand now that what you built isn't just a business, she wrote. It's a calling that requires specific skills, deep knowledge, and authentic commitment to the families you serve. I'm sorry it took criminal charges for me to recognize the value of your work. I read the letter twice, then filed it in my desk drawer. Not because I was dismissing it, but because I wanted to let her words settle before deciding how to respond. The spring semester brought new developments that consolidated our position as a leader in innovative educational services. The Department of Education invited me to present at their national conference on preventing grant fraud. 2 universities reached out about research collaboration studying our methodologies. A national foundation approved funding for our expansion into underserved rural communities. But the moment that felt most significant happened on a regular Tuesday afternoon. Marcus, now thriving in both our programs and his traditional school, brought his younger cousin to visit our center. Miss Zoe, he said, this is Elena. She's having some of the same problems I used to have at school. I told her you might be able to help. Elena was 8 years old, shy and clearly anxious about being in a new place. I knelt down to her level and smiled. Elena, Marcus tells me you're having some challenges at school. Would you like to show me how you learn best? 30 minutes later, Elena was giggling while solving math problems using colorful manipulatives and movement. Her mother was crying tears of relief as she watched her daughter engage with learning in a way that felt natural and joyful. We've been to 3 different tutoring centers, Elena's mother said. Everyone keeps saying she needs to focus better, try harder, sit still longer. You're the first person who's asked how she learns best instead of trying to fix what's wrong with her. Because nothing's wrong with her. She just needs teaching approaches that match how her brain works. After Elena and her family left, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The New Year's Eve night when I'd slept in my car rather than accept my family's dismissal. The months of building something authentic while they planned to steal it. The legal battle that had felt overwhelming but ultimately established important precedents for protecting small business owners from family exploitation. All of it had led to this moment, where a child who might have struggled for years in inappropriate programs would instead get exactly the support she needed from the very beginning. Alex knocked on my office door frame. The new staff orientation starts in 10 minutes. You ready to train our summer expansion team? I looked at the 5 new educators we'd hired, all of whom shared our philosophy about honoring children's diverse learning styles. Each of them had been carefully selected not just for their credentials, but for their genuine understanding that effective education adapts to learners rather than expecting learners to adapt to systems. I'm ready. That evening, I stayed late to update our program evaluation data for the quarterly report to our funding partners. The numbers were impressive. 94% of families reported significant improvement in their children's academic confidence. 87% of students showed measurable gains in targeted skill areas. 96% of families would recommend our programs to others. But beyond the statistics, I thought about the individual stories those numbers represented. Children who'd been labeled as problems discovering they were actually gifted learners who needed different approaches. Families who'd been blamed for their children's struggles finding communities that understood and supported their unique needs. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison, launching my social media wellness workshops next month. Thanks for showing me what authentic work looks like. Then another from Katie, saw the Times article about the Parker Protocol being implemented nationwide. You're famous for all the right reasons now. And finally, one from Alex, tomorrow's enrollment numbers are in. We're officially at capacity. For fall programming. Time to start planning location number 2? I responded to each message, then walked through our center one final time before heading home. The learning spaces we'd created were quiet now, but they held the residual energy of children's discoveries and growth. Tomorrow they'd be full again of kids who were learning that their differences weren't deficits to overcome, but strengths to develop. In my car, I sat for a moment thinking about the building I'd purchased almost a year earlier with money I'd saved while my family dismissed my work as meaningless. That investment had grown into something far beyond what I'd originally envisioned. Not just a successful business, but a model for authentic education that was being replicated across the country. My phone rang one last time. It was Carmen, Marcus's mother. Zoe, I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for our family. Marcus came home today talking about how he wants to become a teacher who helps kids like he used to be. He'd be amazing at that. He said he wants to build something real that helps people, just like you did. I think that's the best compliment anyone could give you. After hanging up, I drove home through the quiet Phoenix streets thinking about legacy and impact. A year ago, I'd been invisible in my own family, sleeping in my car because I didn't fit their aesthetic for success. Now I was training educators across the country, advising federal policymakers, and most importantly, creating daily opportunities for children to discover their own potential. The business I'd built to prove my worth had evolved into something much more significant, a demonstration that authentic work, protected and nurtured, could create ripple effects that extended far beyond any individual success story. At home in my small apartment near the center, I opened my laptop to work on the curriculum outline for our rural expansion program. But first, I pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a letter of my own. Dear Zoe, from 1 year ago, I began. The family that made you sleep in the car was wrong about your value. The work you've been developing in secret will change hundreds of lives. The building you're about to buy will become the foundation for something bigger than you can imagine. Right now, trust yourself. Protect your vision. Don't let anyone convince you that their approval matters more than your authenticity. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I'd kept my mother's apology. Not as artifacts of the past, but as reminders of how far honest work could travel when it was finally free to grow without constraint. Outside my window, the desert stretched toward mountains that were barely visible in the darkness, but I knew they were there. Solid, enduring, shaped by time and pressure into something both beautiful and unshakable. Just like the work we'd built, one authentic relationship at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.